Reverend Kevin Annett. You know, reading what Hitler wrote, reading what Goebbels wrote, they marveled and bought all these history books about the tactics. They bought the Army War College tactics used against the Native Americans. That was their plan, to go into the rest of Europe and the world and systematically put people on reservations, then exterminate them. The model for the U.S. Camps for the Indians was taken from the British, who invented the concentration camp and used it, of course, at a great effect in the Revolutionary War, where Andrew Jackson, who then used it against Indians himself, about being abused and abusing others. His mother and brother died in a British concentration camp. He then used it against the natives. But the point here is Hitler used that exact program for living space. That was their operation. So eugenics grew out of that as well. It's all the same thing over and over again. We're going into the camp economy, but now the international bankers are fully colonizing the United States and bankrupting the old system to fully bring in a tyranny against everyone. So everything that's been done to the natives is now going to be done against you. Sir, continue. Let's get into some of the particular stories that you cover in your two books. Give folks your website about how they would kill these children, how they would sterilize them, what children they would decide not to kill. Was that the ones that they were using for sex slavery? It's always the same. The UN's been caught all over Africa, Asia, Latin America doing the same thing. Thousands of mainstream articles. It's a class of sickos, and they hire new people, and then as they die, they hire new people, and it's a sick culture, and they've grown this horde, this army of darkness they've got worldwide.
Well, yeah, I agree. First of all, my website is www.hiddenfromhistory.org, and on that, it's really a lot of the documentation of the past 12 years or so. Stories, that I began to hear as a minister, one of the first things I began to hear was how children were being systematically bought and sold in these schools, and how it carries on today. Because, as you know, in any system of abuse, those who are abused become abusers, and it's passed down intergenerationally. We know today that Vancouver is actually one of the main centers of child prostitution and pornography in the world, along with Rotterdam, Bangkok, and places like that. There's international sex rings that operate, and a lot of the kids that are still being used are from northern native reserves.
And it's always been like that with orphanages, not just death camp orphanages, and that's what the CPS is today, grabbing children. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, and these are very well-protected rings. We know that there are even Supreme Court judges in British Columbia. There's politicians, fairly wealthy bankers that are directly involved with church lawyers and others in these networks that continue. We've come very close to exposing this on occasion. People who were eyewitnesses to this have actually disappeared. There's over 500 missing Aboriginal women in Vancouver alone. A lot of the work I do is on the streets in the poorer parts of Vancouver. And these people who are living on the street, about 80% of the homeless are Aboriginal. They're all refugees from their own lands because they've been forced off their own lands by their own chiefs who sign these deals with big multinationals and terrorize their own people off their land. So when you look at the history of these chiefs that are doing that, in the residential schools, they were the young kids who would rat on their fellow students. They would inform on the kids when they're speaking their own language, and they were rewarded, culled out, if you like, and given an education and trained to serve the system. And they're still doing that today. When you find that all over the world, like the British Empire did this to my people in Ireland, it's the Crown and the Church working together to create a slave population. And what some of the chiefs here are now learning, like people all over the world have learned, is that the only way to fight that is to declare sovereignty from it. I mean, you folks in America had to do it against Britain. We're going to have to do the same thing here in Canada. And that's what some of the chiefs and others are beginning to do. There was a movement last month.
When your parliament, and continue, notice when your parliament, which was elected, said we're going to kick out your current prime minister, the Queen just came in and did veto and showed everybody she really still runs it.
Well, exactly. In Australia, the same thing happened in 1975. The Governor-General removed the government and put in another one. It's a colonial system, and we still live under that. It's one of the reasons.
And it's the same thing, and continue, but we're going to come back, but I've got to nexus this in. 3.5 months ago, Congress wouldn't pass the Banker Immunity Takeover Bill, so they were threatened with martial law, and War Powers Act was declared, Bloomberg reported. So we're under that now, too, sir. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, it's so blatant in Canada because it's run by the Crown and the Church. The churches are immune from prosecution. It's been proven that they murdered tens of thousands of children deliberately in these schools, and yet not one official has ever been brought to trial for the death of a child in a residential school. So they're immune from prosecution. And you can do that because the Crown and the Church work together. What we need to do in Canada is to replace that system. We need to establish a republic.
Yeah, they call that, what, estoppel or immunity. The true criminals are in power and they have immunity. And I just pray to God that people will realize how much evil is around us and that it's not just stagnant, it's growing. All right, sir, let's specifically continue with, the key points of what's going on and then what it's metastasized into. We know this stuff never goes away. The government now admits, half the kids die that we have, but, that's just how it is. Children will die. I even have a newscast a few months ago we played out of, Oklahoma, where the guy's just arrogantly going, children will die. Well, and they go, but they're dying every day in just this town alone in CPS. And he goes, they will die. That's just how it is. They will die. It's just kind of an attitude of kill them all, let God sort them out. Please continue, sir.
Well, that's exactly it. I mean, if you go to my website, you'll see an interview with a woman called Irene Favel. She's 75 now, but she was a little girl in the 1940s in a Catholic residential school in Saskatchewan. She describes, and this was a CBC television broadcast last July, she said that she stood in front of a furnace and watched a newborn baby being thrown into the furnace by a priest because it was a product of rape. The priest had raped one of the young girls. They took the baby and just threw it in the furnace. And we've had dozens of people describing that kind of thing happening. So it isn't just children dying; they're being deliberately murdered. And none of these people have ever been brought to trial. And frankly, we think the only way they're going to be brought to trial is if Aboriginal people set up their own courts. People in Canada set up their own courts and put the government and church on trial because they're not going to do it to themselves.
You're saying the main three branches of state-approved religion up there are involved in it, and I'm not trying to single out one group, but I want to know who the ringleaders are. Which group is most powerful? The division you were in, or was it the Catholics? Who was it?
Well, ultimately, this whole model of the residential schools was set up by the Vatican in the 1880s. It was called the Duryea Plan to basically establish these residential schools, and the government and the Protestant churches copied it.
And that was a more modern version of what Cortez did.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the buck stops with the Vatican and the Queen of England. She's the head of the Church of England, and those were the two churches that were the favored ones in Canada. The United Church was a more recent creation by the government, but it was set up clearly with the same plan. So, I mean, all three of them are equally culpable, but ultimately, this issue has to be taken to Rome and to London, England, because that's where all of this plan originated, and it continues to be carried out.
Well, I mean, look at what the Catholic Church is today. I mean, there's some estimates that half of them are pedophiles. Mm-hmm. The priest. I mean, this is just unbelievable. Again, I have the CBC News articles. I have a big stack of articles where they admit, 40 to 60% of the children die in our custody, but we're good. I mean, imagine any other industry, any other government, imagine if citizens, half their children died. They'd be like banned parenthood, But instead, the state, and I have the textbooks they teach in England, the U.S., and Canada, they teach social workers the family's a disease that has to be eradicated.
Well, it's amazing that in a way it isn't amazing that they got away with this crime, because in Canada, the population is taught to think of themselves as subjects of the crown, not as citizens, but as subjects who kind of operate according to the whim of a few people in power. And when you're raised in that way, as slaves, basically, it's hard for people psychologically to challenge these churches and governments.
Oh, I know. I have Canadians email me when I'm reading the CBC or mainstream news saying the Queen is in control. She's exercised her governorship. She has now basically overthrown the government because they didn't do what she wanted. And like you said, they did it in Australia a few decades ago. I mean, and then they have all these TV shows acting like they have no power. And then the Canadians send me emails saying, you're making this up, it isn't true, we're in control of our own government. Go ahead.
Well, no, it's clearly that people here aren't in control at all. I mean, to give you an example of that, in British Columbia, the police don't have any independent power to lay charges. It's the Attorney General through the Crown Councils. They're like district attorneys up here. The Attorney General gets to decide who is charged and who isn't charged, which means the party in power, in essence the Crown, can decide to prosecute people, can urge the police to lay off people who are their friends. I mean, it's a completely top-down system of hierarchy, and there's no real experience of democracy here in Canada.
Well, that's right.
So go ahead. That's why these crimes of genocide can be gotten away with so easily.
Well, yeah, that's why you could have a government official pushing the plunger down to blow up the world